Writers. Today I'm excited to be showcasing our first program from outside the U.S. We've gotten several requests to cover a program in Canada, including from listeners Michelle DaCosta and Frank Turner. So I'm excited to bring you this conversation with Neil Griffin of the University of Victoria in British Columbia. We always do our best to fulfill listener requests, even if it takes a while to find someone who fits the bill. So if there's a program you'd like to know more about, please let us know. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/mfawriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Neil Griffin. Neil is a poet, essayist, and former wildlife biologist. A former finalist for CBC's Poetry Prize and multiple Alberta Magazine Awards, his writing has appeared throughout Canada and Western Europe. He's an MFA student at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, where he's working on a book-length lyric essay about extinction. In addition, he is the 2023 Artist in Residence for Ocean Networks Canada, where he writes about the ecology and history of the abyssal regions of the Pacific Ocean. Today, he's going to read an excerpt from his piece titled Hall of the Americas.
In one of my first memories, we are driving in the Canadian Rockies. It is winter. Thick beds of cloud congeal in mountain cirques, mingling with the snowpack, white on white. The sun is only in orange furs, weak behind swaddling layers of a dirty blanket sky. Snow slants across the highway. Bright, hard needles of ice, causing the red taillights of the cars ahead to bleed in the fading light. Driving in a blizzard is a lonely experience, regardless of how many people are in the car. We are quiet, except for the trundling cough of the heater and my dad's soft, under-breath humming. Eventually, we pull into a rest stop and wait for the storm to blow over. The car is buffeted by wind, rocking creakily on old suspension. Out the window, there is a high fence. Beyond it, in the blur of wind and snow, something large and dark is moving towards us, towards the car, towards me. It comes closer, shaggy and brown with an expansive head and wood-carved face, staring benignly into the storm. Its shape forms into a word on my tongue. Buffalo. The seasonal travels of North American buffalo across the Great Plains was once the greatest movement of living things, ever, in the history of Earth. Buffalo were inseparable from this continent, from its ecology, from its relationships between land and land living thing, land and the people who have always lived here. There was no North America without buffalo. There is no North America without buffalo. In the northeast corner of Yellowstone lies the Lamar Valley, home of the last great buffalo rut on Earth. Squatting on a hillside in a patch of sharp purple heather, I laid out a picnic blanket. In the valley below, the buffalo gathered, rising from the river with ivory stoles of condensation streaming from their mouths, and wandering from the woods with curiously dainty steps, as though tiptoeing. There are many videos of buffalo ruts. None of them do it justice. Film cannot convey the speed of the males galloping over the half-frozen earth, their hooves chewing up clods of mud and hurling them high in the air. Collisions of such violence that it seems the entire morning holds its breath, gasping inwardly in a fractional second of silence before exhaling a tremendous crash across the valley, the meaty, visceral crack of bone on bone. Once this was the backing track of a continent. It played alongside the rustling snap of passenger pigeon wings and the churning banks of whale-stuffed seas. Now it is a curiosity, an artifact for bucket lists. A gift shop nearby sells commemorative spoons. Most settler North Americans, if they see a buffalo at all, will see them in a zoo or small protected ranch. They will be docile and quiet, grazing, little more than overgrown cattle. With all sense of the wild bred out of them, it will be difficult to understand what the fuss ever was. If anything, that is the point. The pretense of their survival in captivity is couched in the language of conservation. But what it really means is this. We came, we saw, we conquered. Just another pet species, a minor spectacle, a shadow of their immense, unknowable selves. In 2014, under the co-guidance of Blackfoot writer and lawyer Leroy Littlebear, 13 Indigenous nations in the United States and Canada signed the Buffalo Treaty, an agreement to reintroduce buffalo to their nation's lands. In 2018, following the lead of the Buffalo Treaty, 16 buffalo were returned to Alberta's Panther Valley. Every year since, the population has increased. For the first time since 1861, wild buffalo wander the Canadian plains. It is not enough, but it is a beginning. One summer in northern Montana, I climbed among the soft risings of the Sweetgrass Hills. They are one of America's most endangered environments, preserved mostly because of their remoteness. From their summits, the entirety of the West expands, Medicine Hat to the north, Browning and the Glacier Mountains to the west, empty space to the south and east. Blackfoot scouts used to climb these hills to locate buffalo herds. All I saw from the top were highways, the concrete arteries of interstate travel clogged with bits of nothing, shuttling around blindly. I unfocused my eyes, sought a space beyond the horizon. The morning had been very hot, but there was a breeze on the summit. A golden eagle rode the thermals overhead, its cruciform shape nailed to an empty sky. I pictured dust clouds in the distance. I felt the thundering beat of a million hooves.
Neil, that was beautiful. Thanks so much for reading that for us and for being here to chat with me.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. It's exciting to be here. It's exciting to be the first Canadian I think you've had.
I think you are, and we've had requests for a program in Canada. Tell us about an MFA program in Canada. So you are the lucky person that has all of that weight on your shoulders. Are you ready?
The spokesperson for a nation. I'm ready. I got out all my terrible Canada jokes earlier about living in an igloo, about it snowing all the time, about still using beaver pelts as our primary currency.
Well, before the interview, I asked you where you were from originally, and you just said the plains. I was like, that's a very Canadian thing to say.
Just the flat bit in the middle that people try to fly over.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Missouri, which is, smack dab in the middle of flyover country here in the U.S., so I understand.
Spiritually similar.
Yeah, I can commiserate a little bit. So as I mentioned in your bio, and might be apparent from your reading, you were a wildlife biologist before coming to writing. Do you mind telling us a bit about your career in wildlife biology and how you got into that and what kinds of things you were doing?
Sure. It was kind of an accident, really. I accidentally became a wildlife biologist or an ecologist, technically. My real lifelong dream was just to play drums in a punk band, but I went to university instead. And then I liked going outside. I grew up on the prairies, not far away from the Rocky Mountains. I liked to hike. I liked to go outside. And so when I found out that there was sort of a career you could do where a big part of your year was just spent going outside and looking at animals, that seemed like a cool thing to do. So as an undergraduate student in biology, I would try and work as like a research assistant for people in the summer and spent time in the Rocky Mountains living as a research assistant, which was really just grunt work. You sort of got hired out at this research camp to do work for whoever needed you. So some days I was climbing mountains to check like weather stations at the top, and some days I was counting seeds in mouse shit, which is slightly less exciting. One summer there was this field site in the mountains had a giant flood, and my job for a week was to shovel gravel out of the parking lot.
Exactly how you had dreamed.
How I dreamed, a glamorous job. And then I ended up, towards the end of my degree, I met a woman who worked in primatology and like the study of primates, of monkeys, a sort of Canadian Jane Goodall, although she was actually from Texas. And we got along really well, and she took me on as a graduate student, where I started working in Belize, where I studied howler monkeys and spider monkeys. And then from there, just kind of, it had its hooks in me. I liked this pattern of spending 4 months of the year in sort of wild places, in sort of this solitude with nature and wildlife, and then spending the rest of the year sort of in and around university campuses.
So during that time, were you doing much writing?
I started sort of writing seriously, semi-seriously I was in graduate school, and I was sick of writing scientific papers and this dry, very functional form of writing. Mm-hmm. And so I did what everyone was doing at the time, which was started a blog that like 4 people read. But it was where I started to explore this idea of, well, how can I write about science and nature, but can I bring in sort of literary references, and can I bring in history? Can I bring in all of these other sort of facets of the human experience and try to combine them in a holistic way with sort of what is conventionally thought of as science writing? So I started doing that when I was in grad school, kind of as an escape really from the dryness of scientific writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems that your experience in wildlife biology informs a lot of your writing, which explores the intersections of human and non-human worlds. In what ways do you see your prior experience in that field influencing what you write now?
I think ecology, sort of the study of wildlife, but also its interactions with environments and sort of the chemical and physical systems, it's kind of the most holistic science. It's the science that tries to be the study of everything, which means often that instead of being the study of any particular thing, it's the study of relationships between things. Everything becomes defined by where it sits in relationship to everything else. And one of the central questions of sort of thinking about sort of the natural world, but especially pertinent now, is, well, where do we as humans, as a monolith, but also in the terms of like various human societies and where various human ways of living with the world, how are our relationships? Where do we fit into that holistic approach? And so I tried to bring that. That was a thing that I learned in the study of sciences, that everything is kind of defined in relationship to everything else. And I try to bring that with me into how I write and how I think about writing now.
I wouldn't have really thought that there would be a lot in common between creative writing and biology, but you told me that you see similarities, especially between biology and poetry. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think for me, the two of the similarities really are that you can't rush the study of nature. You can't rush the study of wild places. It's going to happen on its own time. It happens at its own pace. There's an early American-Canadian nature writer, Ernest Thompson Seton, who said once that he described other species, sort of other environments, as being other nations, these things that you can't be fully understand on our own individual terms with sort of our insufficient language, our insufficient terms for understanding. But if you attend to them carefully with focused attention, with openness, and without judgment, you can get a glimpse of something, a glimpse of the world. And that is something that when I started writing poetry and started writing nonfiction felt like a connection for me, this connecting link where I was like, oh, when I try to write something, if I'm rushing it, if I'm forcing it, it's just kind of garbage that ends up coming out, or things that are working on a preordained track that was maybe in my mind already. Whereas if I try and sit with it instead in the way that you have to sit as a wildlife biologist and you're just looking around and recording what happens, that I find that opens something in a way that is different than what you sometimes are expecting to find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, like, to me, this is a conversation about process, right? And like whether you come to a piece knowing what you're going to write or whether you're coming to a piece with that openness that you describe to discover where the piece wants to go. So how do you integrate or foster that idea of being open to the story? How do you integrate that into your process?
Usually it just looks like a giant mess and like multiple neurotic breakdowns through each piece of writing as you wonder whether it's working.
Right.
I remember reading once John McPhee's book, Draft Number 4, which is like his magnum opus about structure really in nonfiction pieces. And there's a part where he talks about how he knows when a piece is ready, when he's ready to write it, when he's figured out his beginning and he's figured out his ending. And for me, that's like the exact opposite. It's sort of anathema to how I work. I start in the middle just by sort of maybe setting a loose boundary about what I think I'm interested in writing about. So for the Hall of Americas, I was interested in writing that larger piece is about the history of really colonial exploitation and extractive thinking in North America, using the buffalo in particular as this sort of vehicle for thinking about that. So I set sort of a boundary and said, well, this is what I'm going to write about. But then I went and read as much as I could about the buffalo from old literature, from contemporary literature. I read scientific stuff. I looked at depictions in art and poetry. I spoke to wildlife researchers. I spoke to farmers and ranchers. I spoke to indigenous people who were working on sort of reintroducing buffalo. I went to places where I could see buffalo. And I tried throughout this to have not a sense of a narrative or a sense of certainty. I didn't want to know where I was going. I was looking for connections rather than dictating this sort of specific path through. I wanted to be open to sort of, well, what emerges out of it. And I think that's one of the interesting things about creative nonfiction, a space that something you can do in that is that we have kind of this assumption of narrative that it should be based on forward momentum. But in a written work, especially a written work of creative nonfiction, with the people who tend to read that, I don't think you have to do that. You can go backwards, you can go forwards, you can argue with yourself, you can undermine yourself, you can just stop, you can leave blank spaces, you can abandon a thought and pick it up again 100 pages later. You can do this thinking and writing that is relational rather than saying, I'm on this set path, this is the arc of my story. There's a much more room to explore and expand and just kind of settle into and sit into a place. And that I try to do that sort of throughout my process, but it sort of looks like making a big mess for a long time.
Right.
And then starting to see these connections between image and idea and history and place, and then starting to sort of thread them together into collage pieces.
Yeah, it's easier said than done, but one of the most important lessons that I've learned and that I continue to learn every time I sit down to draft is that comfort with the chaos, right? And it's something that I still struggle with. It's something that like I know and that I've seen it work really well when I embrace that, but there's a part of me, right? There's a part of me that just wants to know where it's going, that wants to control it. How do you fight back against that? Do you struggle with that at all?
Yeah, I struggle with it a lot. And usually I can feel it sort of I start to feel it in my body when I'm writing this tension. And usually what it means is that it's holding on too hard to an anchor point of something that I'm certain about. Like, oh, this beginning is really great. It sounds good. Or this ending, what a great ending that would be for something. Or a scene or a line or an image somewhere in the middle that I'm really holding on to. And often it's the first thing that I write or the second or third, something early in a piece that becomes a useful like lodestone, a useful like starting point. But then for me, it's a learning to recognize that when I'm getting that, like when I'm trying to center everything around that I'm missing other opportunities. And then it's knocking that point down. And sometimes it's just a matter of like deleting it out of the document that I'm working in so that I'm not looking at that anymore. I'm not rotating the piece around that sort of anchor point. But I feel like it's a constant struggle. It is this sort of tension, this like dialectical movement between like the chaos and structure, and this movement back and forth between the two. And it's, I guess, considering it as a process and embracing it as process, as movement helps abstractly, but the reality of it is still sometimes I think you're just like, I want to know where this is going to go. I want to know if this is going to be good, and then trying to step back from it and saying, maybe it's enough to think about the process of doing it.
Yeah. For me, I have to remind myself constantly when I'm drafting something to turn off the editing part of my brain, because if I let that part in during the drafting process, what will happen is I'll start editing and revising a section that I love. And then once I've spent time editing it, it's so much harder to let it go if the story wants to go in a different direction later.
I have a really sloppy, like messy drafter. So it helps me to not, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to go back and read.
Yeah.
I want to continue moving based on what I think I have written, rather than go back and be like, oh, that's what I actually wrote. That's quite bad.
Well, as we've mentioned, you've written in different genres, but a lot of your work is nonfiction. And nonfiction, especially the kind of journalistic nonfiction that you write, has to deal with what you call a tangled mass of history, memory, experience, and other inputs. How do you juggle all these factors when you're drafting a piece?
A big part of that is, for me, is sort of falling back again on this idea of trying to structure a piece that is relational and trying to structure the voices in it as relating to one another, rather than having one or two that dominate over the other ones. And this, I mean, particularly in any kind of like environmental writing, you often get embedded in it ideas of like of progress, of this like forward momentum, and I try to avoid those. A lot of it is, I mean, some of it is having sensitivity readers, as well as is giving, because I write about things that are often outside of my immediate experience. I might be drawing on the work that I did as a biologist, but I end up writing about things that I'm not an expert in and I don't know about. And so I will have, scientists read the sciencey thing, but I will have friends or hired sensitivity readers read other sections to say, like, am I saying things that are like grossly wrong, grossly offensive? Is my ass hanging out here, like, embarrassingly? Like, please help me out.
Yeah. Tell me before I put it out to the masses.
Yeah, please let me know now. But a big part of it is approaching it as a relational thing, saying, look, there's these different ways of understanding and living in the world. There's these different ontologies of being, and to not privilege one over the other. And trying to have, for me, I have a real distrust of narrative, I think, and a distrust of certainty. And a lot of the way that I frame, which I've kind of undermined by reading a piece that sort of has a narrative, but it's sort of, I try to be aware of, well, okay, am I starting to lead myself towards something because it seems familiar? Am I starting to privilege one voice or one understanding above another one, and trying to this sort of process of second guessing, of questioning, well, what am I doing? Why am I writing this? What are my assumptions? What am I reading and what am I not reading? What am I thinking about and what am I not thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk more about your experience in the program as a creative nonfiction writer. But before we do, I want to hear about how you got from your career in wildlife biology to the MFA program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. I imagine it must have been a difficult decision. So what were the factors you had to consider, and what made you decide to pull the trigger and make this change?
The simple reason was just that I was sort of unhappy in the work that I was doing, where it was good work and it was like solid and reliable, but I didn't feel like totally fulfilled with it, which is one of those like wishy-washy things. There were more practical things. Like, I had stopped largely doing field work, which was the part that I really liked, because I had a quite serious back injury that prevented me from going into the field. And even as it healed, I didn't trust my body doing the sort of rigorous field work. And that was the thing that I really enjoyed. And I'd always liked writing, and I'd always been told, probably by, I assume 3/4 of the people who listen to this at some point had like an English teacher tell them that hey, you're pretty good at this. And that was the same with me. And I was, like everyone else, a weird kid who liked books a lot more than people.
And once someone tells you that, it's all over, isn't it?
Yeah, it's over. Your life is ruined. Like English teachers should be banned from saying that. They're just setting you up for a life of misery. And then one day I was working at this, so I'd started to think about it, and I was sort of like writing poetry on my lunch break and writing little essays on I was waking up early on Sunday mornings and writing little essays. And I'd started taking community workshops in poetry, mostly in and around Calgary where I was living. And then one day the job that I had taken over for a guy who was 10 years older than me. And I was cleaning out all the stuff that he had left on his computer, on the desktop, on the office computer. And I found a half-finished novel and his notes on where he wanted to go, and his notes to himself that were at that point, they were 8 years old, that were hey, don't still be doing this job in 10 years,
wow.
Which is then when I took over for him. And for me, that was that combined with dealing with this injury and this sort of sense all of a sudden that I was oh, if I want to do this, if I want to try this, I should try it now when I'm in a point in life where I don't have that many commitments. I can take this risk. I can afford, I think, financially and sort of metaphysically, the upheaval that this is gonna cause. So then I made a plan. It was important for me to plan, to not just sort of leap into the unknown. So I'd cut down the amount of hours that I was working. I said, okay, I'm going to give this 2 years where I really, really try to write, where I am making an effort to be actively part of a community in Calgary where I was living. I'm going to go to as much sort of community workshops and stuff as I can. I'm going to try and talk to people. I'm going to try and get my work out there. And then I said, okay, when this 2 years is up, if nothing has happened, if I haven't published anything, if everyone that I have shown stuff to has just politely said, wow, you seem to be having a good time, then I was okay, then I'm fine. I'm happy. At least I tried. I ran an experiment, and if it fails, then that's fine. At least I'm happy, and writing can go back to being a hobby for me. And then towards the end of that sort of 2 years, I met the poet laureate of Calgary, Micheline Mailer, for she was doing this meet and greet thing. And she read a bunch of my poems, and she said, hey, these are not bad. They're quite good. There's something publishable in here. There's something in here that can be worked at, that can be sort of drawn out. And that for me was the first moment of validation from someone who I really thought knew what they were talking about and who I admired as an artist. And so to hear that made me go, okay, I'll give it another year. Then I'll try. I won't cut this experiment short. I'll keep going with it and see how it goes. And that's I still sort of continue to check in year after year, every 2 years now, and say, is this still working? How is this still going? And then eventually, unfortunately, I think you do that so long that you're not capable of doing anything else. So.
Well, like I said, you ended up in the MFA program at the University of Victoria, which, according to their website, is one of 3 programs in Canada offering an MFA in writing. Theirs is a 20-month program offering tracks in poetry, playwriting, screenwriting, fiction, and creative nonfiction. Although it is your genre, you told me before the interview that you don't love the term creative nonfiction. What is it about that label that you find less than ideal?
I think it's just a awful term invented in 1982 or something. I think it's a strange term, right? Because it's defined in the negative. It's defined by what it isn't. It's nonfiction, which also means it's creative non-poetry, and it's creative non-stage play, and it's creative non-East African mask dancing. You're working already in this fuzzy kind of negative space of definition, which can be okay and can be, I think, artistically interesting to not be sort of bounded in by something. But then you've got this genre that is including sort of everything from, You got memoir, lyric essay, magazine writing, travel and nature and science writing, narrative history, manifestos, personal essays, op-eds, literary journalism. And all of these really are separate genres within themselves. And there's overlap in places, but they have different sets of definitions, different sets of understandings of craft and technique and conventions. And I think a lot of that comes out in the wash in publishing, because you go to an audience that is interested, who understands the contract that you've made with them about what you're writing. But in workshops and in classrooms, when you've got this really wide spectrum of people, you sometimes get into these conversations and arguments that are not always fruitful, where it's like, well, what's a fact? And what is, a memoirist's idea of a fact or a memory is different from a literary journalist's idea of fact or memory. The appropriate sort of subject matter for talking about is different from someone who thinks of themselves as a travel writer, maybe than someone who thinks of themselves as a personal essayist or an essayist of the private life. And so cramming all of these people into one sort of, often one workshop or one classroom, creates these frictions that I've found to not always be super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of creative nonfiction writers, I think, are writing like personal essays and memoirs, right? So for someone like you doing literary journalism, I imagine the workshop could be a tricky place. Like, how did you navigate some of that?
Yeah, it was frustrating at times. I mean, it depends on the nature of the workshop as well. Like in an unsilenced workshop or an open workshop where I, as the writer, can kind of guide the discussion a little bit. We can talk about what I am interested in. I can bring questions that I'm focused on. Then it's fine, because I can set the expectations for what I want to talk about, and can introduce the piece a little bit. And so then it's not a problem. In like an Iowa style where it's like closed and you're just sitting there, then it was at times frustrating, because you get a lot of stuff like, oh, I want to see more of the writer in this piece, like as a character. And I'd be like, well, I'm not a character in this piece. It's not what I'm trying to do. And I find that often to be frustrating as well, because my experience has been that sometimes putting putting yourself in as a character, it provides such an easy access point. It provides this kind of anchoring point, similar to maybe getting like stuck in a draft, that people they can grab onto. And I don't necessarily want to be an anchoring point in a piece of writing, partially because I don't like to write about myself, but also partially like I'm a white dude. Like there's enough of that anchoring around my kind of I out there. And so there's questions of sort of gaze, of how are you looking out? Are you looking in? Where and how and who are you looking at? And because a lot of CNF tends to be memoirists and personal essayists, the assumptions tend to be that, it's about the writer specifically. But again, it's a problem in like silenced workshops or Iowa style stuff. As soon as you can introduce a piece, it becomes much less of an issue.
Well, I imagine one thing that might make navigating those differences in the workshop and in a program easier would be if the program was smaller. And your program is smaller. You told me that the supervisors/advisors take only 1 or 2 students at a time, which means you get a lot of attention one-on-one. How has your experience been working with the faculty at the University of Victoria? And what are some benefits of that one-on-one attention?
It's been really great. I had measured expectations going into an MFA and did a lot of research and talked to a lot of different potential supervisors at a lot of different schools. But this one, you get basically as much one-on-one time as you want with your supervisor. Mine has I've been her only student for the time that I've been there. And it's nice to know you never need to double back or like remind them what you're working on.
Right.
There's no need to recover old ground. There's a lot of flexibility I found in how often we meet, how much attention that there is. It's very easy to find sort of space when you want space, or more intense focus when you want more intense focus. It's easier for the department budget to focus on just buying you lunches instead of buying lunches for like 7 other students.
Right.
And so it's been great for that, where I feel like, I mean, partially it's flattering to the ego, I guess, knowing that if they're only taking one student a year, basically one every 2 years, that they want you, like it's your project, it's your work that they're excited about. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily I got to fill up the numbers at other bigger MFA programs, but it's nice to know that, out of all the applications that my supervisor looked at, mine was the one that she was interested in working with. And that, for me at least, has felt carried through working with her, where I feel like my work is important to her, that she believes in it, but also because it's such a small program, I'm familiar with a lot of the other faculty and can also talk to them. So you sort of have like one major supervisor, but then there's 3 or 4 other people in the department that you can go to as well, who are also familiar with your work through the nature of the small classes that we have as well, that you have lots of different sort of touchstones and people that you can bounce off of in terms of like faculty help, which has been really great for me.
Yeah, it seems to me being in a smaller program makes building those relationships with faculty members much easier. I guess there is some risk in a small program of struggling to build community amongst your cohort and the other students, just because there are fewer people. So how has the sense of community been amongst your cohort and in the program as a whole?
My cohort in particular was a weird one because we came in, because we're weird, but mostly because we came in, we were the COVID cohort. So we came in all online for the first year. So we didn't really meet each other. I knew some of them already and had worked with some of them because they were from Victoria. So I knew some of them from like working in sort of art spaces around Victoria, but it was still a strange thing just being online and not really seeing each other for the first year of the program. And then that kind of carried on. It was more difficult, I think, for us to build a sense of community. But the cohorts that I've seen come up since they're all buddy and love each other and have group chats and are constantly hanging out. But I think, you in a small cohort, I think you'll still make friends. Like that won't be, making friends is not a problem. But the question is like, is there going to be people there that you sort of get that rich sense of creative communion with? Are you going to find people who are good readers of your work, or people who think in ways that are useful in the ways that you think, that you can have this sort of like dense, meaty conversations with? And that is more of a kind of up in the air, like you hope you get lucky with it, right. That you can find someone. And maybe that's the case at larger programs too. I assume the odds are likelier that you're likely to find that, but it still depends like who's coming in and what are the literary trends at the time. Everyone's writing autofiction these days. So if you love autofiction, any MFA program, you're probably going to find people to get along with. If you're writing just concrete poetry, that might be tougher for you. But there is a flip side as well, which is that because we get all of these different people, all of these small group of different people who are often working in very different genres, it does mean a kind of exposure that you wouldn't get otherwise. So it's exciting to be in these like multi-genre workshops that we take, where like I'm turning in whatever kind of essays I'm writing and someone else is turning in poetry and someone else is turning in a screenplay. And we're finding ways to talk to one another. We're finding ways to become not fluent necessarily in each other's genres, but to try and enter into them sort of honestly and openly, and relying on the grounding of our like relationships with one another to then say, well, I don't really understand how a screenplay works, but this is what I'm seeing here. This is what I'm feeling. This is how I react to it. And sometimes the stuff that you're seeing and feeling and reacting to is maybe not super useful, but there are some times where that sort of beginner's mind sees things that can be obscured if you're just talking to other experts or other specialists. So there is this like this sort of and it's an in-between kind of thing that has got its pros and cons.
Well, one thing that is clear from the program's website is the emphasis on learning to teach creative writing. So while in many programs in the States, MFA students teach composition, you told me that you've mostly taught creative writing. How has that experience been?
It's been great. It's been one of the best parts of the MFA program here. I don't know how common this is in other schools, but the University of Victoria has a full undergraduate program in creative writing, a full 4-year workshops and lecture program that we are attached to them. So there are a couple of hundred undergrads running around all the time, panicking about their literary futures, and it's really exciting to be part of that. In the grad program here, in your first year, you take a long and very thorough seminar on pedagogy in creative writing that talks about how to teach workshops. It talks about teaching larger lecture courses. You draft syllabuses and sort of chew through all the problems of creative writing from can writing even really be taught, to what do I do when one of my students is being a huge asshole to every other student in workshop? And you do lots of role playing where you get to be the rude asshole, and the other grad students have to deal with you. And it's a really thorough, sort of interesting, exciting class that helped me to think about how to teach writing, but also helped me to sort of reflect on what do I think sort of writing is? What do I value in it? What's important in it that I would want to expose students to? And then you come out of it with draft syllabuses prepared and a teaching philosophy and a full sort of package ready to apply to teaching positions with, which is also great. But then there's a lot of opportunities for teaching in the department. Grad students, I did half of a semester-long poetry workshop where the prof was teaching one half of the students and I would do the other half of the students. And it was great to just be I'm just facilitating a workshop for these enthusiastic students and getting the experience of doing that and of responding to their poems and watching them respond to each other. The major sort of teaching thing is this first year writing class that all of the undergraduates take. So it's 120 students who take it. It's a year-long class where every month they learn a different genre, one of the different sort of streams of focus. So they got a month of short fiction, a month of nonfiction. That confuses them a lot because they don't know what nonfiction is, a month of poetry, etc. And you as a graduate student basically teach half of that class. It's 80 minutes twice a week. One of those classes, they're in a big lecture hall with a professor, and the other 80 minutes, you've got 30 of them with you in a little lecture room, and you're doing whatever you want with them. You lecture, you run workshops, you do writing exercises, and you build a sense of community with these students and watch them progress week after week. And it's really just a thrilling thing. And also has really helped my writing to know that when I'm stuck on something, when I'm frustrated and I feel like it's not going anywhere, that you're working with 100 different students, and at least a couple of them at any one moment in time are having those lightning flashes of revelation where something has just broken open for them and they are seeing writing in a way that they've never seen it before. And that kind of enthusiasm is infectious, and it reflects back on your own work.
All right. So now let's talk about something much more boring than enthusiasm towards writing: funding. The cost of attending the program, I think it's important for listeners to know, will be different depending on whether they're from Canada or another country like the US. And it doesn't appear from the website that funding is guaranteed for every MFA student, but there do seem to be opportunities available. So I was hoping you could clear some of this up. Are you receiving funding for the teaching you're doing?
Yeah, so you get funding is the one question. Well, when I was looking into grad schools, and my eventual supervisor here was telling me what to ask and what to say and what to look for, and she was don't go into debt, make sure you're getting paid. That was her number one thing. So I'm not sure funding is officially guaranteed, but everyone that I've spoken to has gotten $10,000 as an entry scholarship for their first year, which covers tuition plus a bunch if you're Canadian. If you're American, it would maybe cover tuition. I'm not sure what the difference, like for a Canadian, our universities are relatively inexpensive on sort of compared to American universities, at least. Working as a TA pays $28 an hour. Again, Canadian, so I think that's like $6 US probably. But and I think sessional instructors, as far as I know, it's between 4,000 and 6,000 for the semester. There is a lot of funding available. It's a big research university, and you're in a very small cohort. So anything that you apply for, there's only 5 or 6 other people applying for the same thing. So the odds of getting funding are quite good for sort of the art specific grants and the writing specific grants. My friends who are in the department who haven't got that funding are screaming at their phones right now. But there is funding out there. It's a lot easier if you're Canadian. A lot of the funding is tied up. A lot of the major grants for master's students in Canada are federal grants that are tied up with being Canadian. So it's much harder if you are American, but the department, all of the American students that we have right now are also like teaching and have been like found jobs in and around the department. So it seems like it's quite good at taking care of people that come in. But yeah, there's funding, but you do kind of you got to find it a little bit, which is one of the things I think that it's important to consider in a supervisor for applying anywhere, is to ask them or ask their former students, hey, is your supervisor good at like directing you towards those sources of funding, grants and bursaries and scholarships? Because all that stuff is out there, but it's always hidden and obscured, and it's hard to find. I've never seen a central database of like, here's where all the money is.
Right.
But in my case, my supervisor has been very good at sending me things, usually like 2 days before the application is due, but sending me things saying like, hey, you should apply for this. This will work. I think we can spin your project to be relevant for this.
The website is pretty good about showing the differences and how much you'll pay if you're a Canadian versus an international student. So I encourage listeners to go check that out on the website. I think it gives you a specific number for how much it costs. But at the same time, don't be afraid to just like ask the people at the school, right? Ask whoever you can get in contact about how much funding you'll be getting. And if you get into the program, I think don't be afraid to say, hey, I can't come unless I get this or that. So you mentioned the scholarships that most students receive. I saw on the website that there's this thing called the University of Victoria Fellowship Award and the University of Victoria Graduate Award. I assume that's what you're referring to. Is that something that applicants are automatically in the running for, or is there like a separate application? Or is that something they should just ask their supervisor?
It would be good to ask the supervisor to be sure. The grad award, I think you're just automatically in your first year, like considered for it. And as far as I have been able to tell, it's basically in your first year, sort of everyone gets it. It's the funding package. And then after that, there's a period in the summer where you send an application package just to the graduate advisor that is like a statement of intent of what you're working on and your CV and a portfolio of recent work. And then they take that stuff, that little package, to the grad department where all of the grants are and money is thought about. And they sort of, rather than you applying to like 40 different university grants, you give a package to the department, and then they take it to the larger body of granting agencies.
And you mentioned earlier that for teaching, you get paid 28 Canadian dollars an hour. I feel like I should ask, how many hours, quote unquote, are you working per semester or per week, or how does that work?
It depends on the class. The big class, the Writing 100 class, it works out to that is like 8 hours a week. So it's not, that's how probably it breaks down. So it's not that much, but you're probably TAing 2 to 3 classes at a time. I have found my experience with TAing, and I have said no to a bunch of TA positions as well. My experience with TAing has been that it will pay my rent, that it's enough in a semester to pay rent, and then the university funding has generally been enough to pay tuition plus some of my sort of other expenses. And then it's scrabbling together other sort of grants or things to pay for anything else. Victoria's also right now a very expensive, it's the second most expensive city in Canada to live in. For some reason, we don't even have a diner that's open 24 hours a day. So I don't know what the draw is, but that's also something to consider when thinking about UVic, is that it's a great school and a beautiful sort of city. It's also a very expensive one right now.
You mentioned 8 hours a week. Is that for one class? And then if you did 2 classes, would you be working 16 hours a week?
So the 8 hours a week, yeah, that's for one class. If you're doing 2 or 3 classes a week, you're probably at closer to like 12 or 14 rather than immediate, like doubling up to 16. It depends on the course, how many hours they pay you for. It depends on whether it's a course where you're just like grading stuff or whether it's a course where you're sort of in a classroom teaching and need like prep time as well. There are also a bunch of like teaching fellowships and things that you can apply for to build your own courses if you want to. There was just like this, I think it was like a $16,000 like altogether thing allocated to the department for someone to like build a new course for a grad student to build and teach a new course. So there are the other opportunities sort of arise.
Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of asking and being on the lookout, and if you need help, ask for it.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. It's been super interesting talking about your work, and this has been super informative, I think, for anyone who is considering the University of Victoria. Before we go, I want to give you the last word. What is one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when applying?
So I think it mostly met my expectations. I asked a lot of people, students and teachers, about MFAs before applying to them to try and get my expectations at an appropriate level. Where I was like, I want some time to write, to work on a long project, and to be surrounded by other people who think that's a legitimate way to spend your time. And so I got that out of it. The thing that I've found to be what I didn't expect was that it can be quite lonely at times. Part of that is the size of the program, but part of it also is, an MFA program is it's a transient experience. People are flitting in and they're flitting out. It's sort of this temporary stop off on a professional thing. And that means that you make these quite intense connections with people, but they're often brief, especially in a city like Victoria where people don't really plan to stay. They're here to do their degree, and then they're going to Vancouver, or they're going to Toronto, or if they have rich parents, they're going to New York. So that's the thing that I found to be a little unexpected to me, is that it's been, especially, I think it's the summer now, so lots of people are off doing their own things, and without sort of a structure of the school year, I found it to be lonelier at times than I expected. But it's possible also that I just learned that I am more gregarious than I thought I was, and used to collaborative work. And now you're sort of, even when you're together with a bunch of other people, you're often hived off into your own sort of individual projects a lot. So that is something to think about. I think lots of writers are sort of naturally inclined towards solitude, and that's sort of part of the work, I suppose, in general, is you do spend a lot of time just by yourself. But to be aware of that, especially if you're moving to a new city, to ask, well, how much alone time do I actually like? And then to seek sort of community if you need it.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate your thoughtful answers and your honesty, and I wish you the best of luck with your writing moving forward. And hopefully an all-night diner comes to Victoria one of these days soon.
God, I hope so. Thanks for having me on.